Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. It is Monday. Happy Monday. So, ex-member of Danity Kane and Diddy Dirty Money, Dawn Richard, returned to the witness stand today. She had previously testified last Friday that she saw Diddy attack Cassie with a skillet that had eggs in it. Now, today, Diddy's team tried to make her seem less believable by pointing out parts of her story that didn't match up, and by bringing up the fact that she still tried to work with Diddy even after seeing the alleged attack. Now, this video is just a recording of the court transcript. I might come back later and do a full summary of everything that happened today at Diddy's trial, if I get a chance. Alright, so here is Dawn Richard's testimony transcript. The judge says the U.S. may call its next witness. Prosecutor says, Your Honor, the government calls Dawn Richard. The prosecutor says, Where are you from? Dawn says, New Orleans, Louisiana. Prosecutor says, From 2004 and 2011, who did you work for? Dawn says, Puff Sean Combs. The prosecutor says, Do you see him? Dawn says, Yes. Prosecutor says, Who is depicted in this photo? Dawn says, Cassie. Prosecutor says, In 2009, did you observe an incident between Puff and Cassie? Dawn says she was attacked by Sean Combs, kicked. Prosecutor says, Did you see more violence by him against Cassie? Dawn says, Often. Photos of Diddy, Dirty Money shown. Prosecutor says, When were you a member of this group? Dawn says 2009 to 2011. Prosecutor says the incident in 2009 when Sean Combs beat Cassie, where was it? Dawn says in Sean Combs' LA home, we were recording. Prosecutor says, Miss Richard, what, if anything, was Cassie doing in the kitchen? Dawn says she was cooking breakfast. She was cooking eggs. Prosecutor says, and you said she was cooking breakfast. Was she doing that at night? Dawn says, at night, yeah. Prosecutor says, just to be clear, and where was Mr. Combs at that time? Dawn says he was at the top level, the floor above us. Prosecutor says, what did you observe Mr. Combs do? Dawn says he came downstairs angry and was saying, where the F was his eggs? Excuse my language. And he was telling Cassie that she never gets anything right. Where the F is his food? And he proceeded to come over to her and took the skillet with the eggs in it and tried to hit her over the head with it, and she fell to the ground. Prosecutor says, let me ask you a couple of questions about that. You testify that Mr. Combs grabbed a skillet and eggs, correct? Dawn says, correct. Prosecutor says, Miss Richard, what happened after Cassie dropped to the ground in the fetal position? Dawn says, he started to punch her and kick her. Prosecutor says, and again, when you say he, who are you referring to? Dawn says, Sean Combs. Prosecutor says, where was Mr. Combs kicking and punching Cassie? Dawn says, her body and her head. Prosecutor says, after you observed Mr. Combs kicking and punching Cassie on the ground, what did you observe next? Dawn says he proceeded to take his arm around her neck and put his hand in her hair and drag her upstairs to the first floor. Prosecutor says, what, if anything, did you hear from upstairs? Dawn says, glass breaking and yelling. Prosecutor says, Miss Richard, how did you react to seeing and hearing this? Dawn says, I was scared for her and scared to do anything in fear of what that might mean for me too. Prosecutor says, Miss Richard, when you say you were scared of doing anything, did you intervene between Mr. Combs and Cassie? Dawn says, no. Prosecutor says, did you call for law enforcement assistance? Dawn says no. Prosecutor says, why not? Dawn says, I had never seen anything like that before, and I didn't know what that would mean. I was scared of what that might mean for myself. Prosecutor says, can you explain what you mean by that? Dawn says, he was punching his girlfriend. He was beating her up in front of us, and I was scared if I intervened or did anything that it might get worse. Prosecutor says, what, if anything, were you directed to do the next day? Dawn says, Sean Combs called us to come in and record. Prosecutor says, when you say we, who are you referring to? Dawn says, Kalina and myself. Prosecutor says, did you follow Mr. Combs' instructions? Dawn says, yes. Prosecutor says, what did Mr. Combs do once you and Kalina Harper arrived at his residence? Dawn says, he brought us into the recording studio and locked the door. Dawn says, Diddy says that it has been passionate and Cassie was okay, that it would be better if we didn't talk, that people could end up missing. Prosecutor says, how did you understand that? Dawn says, death. Then Diddy's lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, says, objection. Then they had a sidebar. They came back from the sidebar. The judge says, jurors, you can leave for the weekend. Watch the Yankees play the Mets or the Knicks. If you are not into sports, there's a lot going on. See you Monday. The jurors leave, and then the judge says, Miss Richard, you can leave. Then the judge says about this line of testimony. Then prosecutor Cormier says this shows consciousness of guilt for count 1 and relevant to count 1. Then Mark Agnifilo says it's not sex trafficking, it's domestic violence. The judge says, why didn't you bring a motion limine on this? Then Diddy's lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, says, I didn't know. Now fast forward to today, Monday. The judge says, all rise. The judge says, on the defense's application, with regard to Dawn Richard, Ms. Garago's opening statement opened the door to this testimony. As to Mr. James, the testimony would be inadmissible absent more. Prosecutor says, as I argued in my letter, the judge says, the same brand of testimony that was objected to on Friday. Does the government expect Ms. Richard to say what she heard and saw? Prosecutor says yes. The judge says that would be permissible, just like the testimony in the recording studio. Prosecutor Slavic says personal assistants were with Mr. Combs 20 hours a day. Their testimony is admissible. The judge says, my concern is that there are other ways to get this evidence in. What Mr. James would add is just the postscript. Then Mark Agnifilo says, on the David James issue, this defeats the whole purpose of this hearsay objection. The government is arguing that it's all admissible because the job descriptions are so vague. We contend these are personal matters. The judge says, let me focus you on the assault on the chef. Mr. James learns from a member of the security detail that Mr. Combs assaulted the chef. Wouldn't that be in the scope of their employments? Mark Agnifilo says, I don't know what relevance this has to do with racketeering. Agnifilo says this is becoming a sort of bad act free for all. Assault is just not one of the racketeering acts. Prosecutor Slavic says this is relevant to the means and methods of the enterprise. The chef is identified as a victim of forced labor. Mark Agnifilo says, I'm going to defer to Ms. Westmoreland on the other witness. Diddy's lawyer, Westmoreland, says Ms. Richard claims that Mr. Combs assaulted Ms. Ventura right in front of her. These other alleged threats are nowhere near in close proximity to an alleged assault. Westmoreland says we have to distinguish between the Danity Kane and the Diddy Dirty Money eras. And Mr. Pierre telling her, where are you going to go? I don't see how that can be construed as a threat. The judge says, let me think about it. The judge says, we have an application from the press that emails be put in the record. I am directing you to put them together and put them in the docket by next Tuesday. And after that, on a weekly basis. Then the jury enters. Prosecutor Slavic says, when Mr. Combs told you people could go missing, how did you interpret it? Dawn says that people could die. I couldn't believe that this could be the beginning of a journey for us. Prosecutor Slavic says, as Diddy Dirty Money? Dawn says yes. I'm going to just call her Slavic instead of saying Prosecutor Slavic, because, yeah. Slavic says, what did you observe? Dawn says he would drag her and kick her and punch her in the mouth. Slavic says, what would prompt these acts of violence? Westmoreland Diddy's lawyer says objection. The judge says overrule. Dawn says when she would speak up for herself. Slavic says who in security witnessed these things? Dawn says D-Rock and Roger Bonds. Slavic says where did Miss Ventura get hit? Dawn says her knees, her face, all over. Slavic says, did there come a time you were in New York for a festival? Dawn says yes, in Central Park. Slavic says, and the residence, what happened? Dawn says he punched Cassie. She came into the bathroom crying. You could see her upset, like she was hurt. Then Diddy's lawyer, Westmoreland, says objection. The judge says sustained. Slavic says, what injuries did you observe? Dawn says swollen eye. Slavic says, why did you remain with Miss Ventura after this incident? Dawn says, I wanted her to feel supported. Slavic says, what is this? They showed a photo of Cassie in sunglasses and Dawn in sunglasses too. Slavic says, why did you wear them? Dawn says, we wore sunglasses to have solidarity with Cassie and have a support system because she needed it. Slavic says, the next assault, who was there? Dawn says D-Rock, Capricorn Clark, Harv Pear. Slavic says, who was Mr. Pear? Dawn says, add that boy, answering to Sean Combs. Slavic says, did they do anything? Dawn says, none of us did anything. Dawn says, when we drove back to LA, he slapped Cassie in the mouth and told her to shut the F up. Slavic says, how did the passengers respond? Dawn says, we stayed silent the rest of the ride. Dawn says, I asked myself, if he did that to someone he supposedly loved, what would he do to an employee? So I would approach Mr. Combs with softness. Slavic says, did you try to intervene in the relationship? Dawn says, no, for my own safety. Slavic says, did you see Mr. Combs using drugs? Dawn says, yes, weed, ketamine, Molly, cocaine. Slavic says, opiates? Dawn says, that I never saw. Slavic says, who brought him the drugs? Dawn says, this guy named One Stop. He had it all, including Plan B, birth control. Slavic says, did you see Mr. Combs with guns? Dawn says, yes, handguns on his lower back. Slavic says, who else had guns? Dawn says, security, D-Rock, and Roger Bonds. Slavic says, what did you do after Bad Boy? Dawn says, sing. Whenever I got momentum, I would get a FaceTime from Diddy. Slavic says, how would you speak to him? Dawn says, very soft. I would always call him bro. Slavic says, why did you not disclose the abuse you had seen? Dawn says, I was told not to by Mr. Combs and Harv Peer. Slavic says, when did you speak out? Dawn says, 2024. Dawn says, I saw Ms. Ventura take the stand and tell the truth. Diddy's lawyer, Westmoreland, says objection. The judge says sustained. Slavic says, did you see Ms. Ventura file a civil lawsuit and then you file your own? Dawn says yes. The judge says cross-examination. Diddy's lawyer, Westmoreland, says, you are aware there's a motion to dismiss your lawsuit. Dawn says, I have several lawyers. Westmoreland says, you sat with the prosecutors and your allegations have changed. Dawn says, I have been consistent. Westmoreland says, you testify he attempted to hit her about the eggs and Ms. Ventura dropped down in a fetal position, right? Dawn says, yes. Westmoreland says, did you ever say you heard a pan hit the wall? You didn't see it. Dawn says, I don't recall. Westmoreland says, would you agree with me? It has been hard for you to keep your story straight with respect to this egg incident? Dawn says, I told it as close as I could. Westmoreland says, the day after, you said Mr. Combs said people go missing. Dawn says, yes. Westmoreland says, let's go to your interview on March 18, 2025. You did not say anything about Mr. Combs told you people go missing. Dawn says, I don't recall that. Westmoreland says, no worries. I'm going to show you a document for the parties only. Page 5. Westmoreland says, isn't it true? The first time you said this was a week ago? Would you like me to show you your previous interviews? Dawn says, I know what I said. Westmoreland said, you said Mr. Combs made a death threat, one that you didn't recall 7 times. Westmoreland says, let's move to the alleged incident before the Central Park concert. You are aware there was a camera crew. Dawn says, not in the bathroom. Westmoreland says, you were filmed in the park. Are you aware if the video has been turned over? Dawn says no. Westmoreland says, about the guns, you didn't tell the prosecutors about. I saw guns at Diddy's house. Dawn says, they didn't ask. Westmoreland says, you never saw Mr. Combs pull a gun out and wave it around, load bullets, or cock it. Dawn says, he just had it. Westmoreland says, did you tell the government you never saw Mr. Combs do cocaine? Dawn says, I don't recall. Westmoreland says, your testimony has changed on quite few things. Dawn says, as time progresses, I remember more. Westmoreland says, you saw one stop sell drugs. You saw him take money? Dawn says, yes. Westmoreland says, all right, 1 second. Didn't you tell the government you never saw anyone pay him? So you lied, right? Dawn says, no. The judge says, sidebar. Then they came back from the sidebar. Westmoreland says, it was you who reached out to Mr. Combs to work with him again. Dawn says, yes. Westmoreland says, but he had threatened you, right? You asked him to work with you again. Dawn says, yes. Westmoreland says, okay. Westmoreland says, the songs you have released on your own have not reached the level of what you released with Danity Kane and Diddy Dirty Money, right? Dawn says, true. Westmoreland says, and you reached out to Mr. Combs to try to make more money, right? Dawn says, yes. And then the prosecutor says, can we have a short sidebar? But the sidebar wasn't short. It was a long sidebar. They came back. Then the redirect. Prosecutor Slavic says, why did you file your civil lawsuit? Dawn says, when I worked for Sean Combs, I had no sleep, the conditions. Slavic says, in every meeting with the government, did you say that Mr. Combs beat Ms. Ventura? Dawn says yes. Slavic says, why did you reach out to Mr. Combs? Dawn says, one of the judge on making the band, Lorianne Gibson, I wanted to reach out. Then Westmoreland says objection. The judge says sustain. Slavic says, how often would you hear from Mr. Combs after you left Diddy Dirty Money? Dawn says sporadic. Slavic says, why did you reach out? Dawn says to help Kalina Harper. Slavic says no further questions. Then Diddy's lawyer, Westmoreland, says, may we have a brief conference at the bench? And they did. And now another recross-examination. Westmoreland says you admit you reached out to Mr. Combs to re-engage. You claim only to have a relationship with Lorianne Gibson, but if it got back together, you would have to see Mr. Combs more, right? Dawn says yes. Westmoreland says you sued for money, right? Dawn says for justice. Westmoreland says, but the lawsuit asked for money, right? Dawn says yes. Westmoreland says no further questions. The judge says, Miss Slavic? Miss Slavic says no redirect. And that is all, you guys, for Dawn Richard's testimony. If you enjoy videos like this, give it a thumbs up. All right, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss any new updates, all the latest updates, all right? And I will see you on the next one. Peace.